Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part, and then when Jesus comes, we will see fully. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about the prophetic shadows in the Super Bowl and the Groundhog Days, some of the things that I was seeing. Obviously, other people can probably see some other things that I didn't notice, but these are the things that I wanted to talk about. Okay, so with the game, it was Super Bowl 54, and we had the San Francisco 49ers playing against the Kansas City Chiefs. So, what was interesting to me was that the colors that they wore were white jerseys versus red jerseys. And so that was interesting. And at first, I was like kind of confused because the people that wore red won, and so that like seemed backwards from what I was seeing. And then I found something that comes out of the Tu B'Shvat, the New Year for Trees Seder, and they use red and white wine in the Seder, and so we'll talk about that because it's kind of interesting what they come up with. Okay, and so just talking about some of the numbers that showed up. So in the first quarter, we had the score at the end of the quarter was 3-7, with the Chiefs winning the first quarter. And then the second quarter was 10-10, and then the third quarter was 20-10, and the fourth quarter was 20-31. Okay, so one thought I had was the 7 in the first quarter. So let's say the Kansas City Chiefs would be a picture of God's people, because one of the things that I wanted to bring out was how they were the underdogs. And so it's been 50 years since they have won a Super Bowl, or been to the Super Bowl even maybe. And so they are definitely a picture of an underdog team. So let's say that they're a picture of God's people, because obviously right now in the world with the left really having a lot of power right now, God's people really are underdogs. We are in a pattern just like in Egypt, where we're, like in slavery to the powers, that are in charge right now. And so God's people are really kind of being oppressed and are, underdogs and stuff. And so in the first quarter, so I wanted to propose that the 4 quarters relate to 4 seasons that we've been through. And so the first quarter would relate to the season of a time when God's people had were a little bit more where they weren't in slavery. They were kind of a little bit more on top. We had a little bit more influence in the country and in the world. And so that would be a picture of the Kansas City Chiefs, kind of leading by 4 points. And so because I wanted to propose that the 7 in the first quarter relates to the 7 mountains, the 7 mountains in Revelation. And so that would be a picture of God's people, the 7 mountains, the 7 churches. Okay, and then in the second quarter, but we still see like the 49ers got 3 points in the first quarter. So kind of like this picture of the left still kind of having influence in the world. And then in the second quarter, it was a tied score, 10-10. And so I wanted to propose that the 10 in the second quarter relates to the 10 in the wilderness who have no faith. The books of, in the Torah, in the beginning of the Bible, the people that were wandering in the wilderness with Moses. So what I wanted to propose was that the second quarter was a picture of like the time when Obama was the president, because Christians definitely got oppressed during that time. So that was my thinking about the second quarter. The third quarter would be a picture of the time when Trump was president. And so the score there was 20-10, with the 49ers having 20 points and the Chiefs having 10. And so I wanted to propose that the 20 in the third quarter relates to the two witnesses, because during President Trump's presidency, we had President Trump and we had Prime Minister Netanyahu were the two witnesses. And so that's what I wanted to propose about that. And then in the fourth quarter, so what we see is, so I actually heard that, like, my brother-in-law, when he was watching the game, they kind of like, he thought the 49ers were going to win, so he kind of turned off the TV and he kind of left. And then he found out in the fourth quarter that there was this big turnaround. And so I wanted to propose that this fourth quarter is a picture of what's going to happen, that we're going to have this big turnaround for God's people, and that the first will be last and the last will be first, and there'll be a reversal of fortunes. And so that's what we saw in the fourth quarter, that all of a sudden the Kansas City Chiefs, they scored 21 more points, to really bring it to a win. And then, so the 21 points that they got, I want to propose that they could relate to, there's two different things they could relate to. They could relate to 777, and it could relate to 3 times 7. And so 777, I always kind of connect that to Lamech and how he lived to be, 777 years old, and then he died. Now, Lamech in the Bible was like the father of Noah, and he was the one who, he said, this is, here, so I found it in the Bible. This is Genesis 5, 29, where Lamech says, now he called his name Noah, the name of his son, saying, this one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground, which the Lord has cursed. And then it goes on in verse 31st, it says, at verse 31, it says, so all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. So I kind of think that Lamech could be a picture of Netanyahu, and that what we're seeing in this is kind of a shadow of how he is identifying Trump as being a potential messianic type figure. And he's saying, and he's actually said stuff like this, where, where he says about Trump, this guy's going to give us rest from work. He came up with this deal of the century that's going to bring peace to Israel. And I'll actually quote you later in the video what he exactly said. And so you could see that he's saying things really similar. So that could be what we see in this fourth quarter. And then, but we could also look at 21 as being connected to 3 times 7. And so 3 connects to the Messiah. Both 3 and 7 connect to the Messiah, because 7 is the number of perfection and completion, and 3 is the number that connects to resurrection and his Jesus's resurrection. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, and so then I wanted to talk about the red and the white. Okay, and so I quoted, this is a book that I'll read occasionally. It's called From the Jewish Way, Living the Holidays by Rabbi Irving Greenberg, and it's copyrighted 1988, the book that I have. And it's a very good book if you want to understand kind of the subtle beliefs, maybe not even subtle, but the beliefs of the Jewish people connected to their holidays. Some of the the shadows that come in their with their traditions that they do for the holidays and stuff like that. It's very interesting. Okay, so let me read to you what he wrote about. Okay, so for Tu B'Shavat, which is the New Year for trees, which on the Hebrew calendar is coming up on February 10th. February 9th is the eve of the holiday, and then February 10th is the holiday. And so it was kind of interesting that This Super Bowl happened a week before the eve of the holiday. Um, that's interesting. And then it was interesting that it was we saw red and white jerseys. Because let me read about. Okay, so then they'll have a seder for to be Shabbat, and um, they have, just like the Passover Seder, they'll have 4 cups of wine. But what they do there is they have red and white wine. And so let me read this to you. The Seder was as follows. The group gathered at nightfall, well lit with candles. Pitchers of white and red wine were placed on the table. The Kabbalists believed that white represented the forces of hibernation and exfoliation, the cumulative loss of life's power due to the shrinking sunlight. For the hours of sunshine had been declining all these months from the summertime peak. Red represented the forthcoming reawakening of nature's life force and the coming seasonal strengthening of the sun. It was as if the forces of life and death, sunlight and darkness, awakening and hibernation were locked in final battle. With the triumph of the red, spring would not be far behind. The first glass, consisting entirely of white wine, was poured. Now a second cup of wine was poured. The cup consisted mostly of white wine with a small portion of red blended in. The third cup, consisting of half white wine and half red wine, was now poured. The fourth cup, mostly red wine with a bit of white wine mixed in, was now poured. Okay, so see how each of the cups, there's a different proportion of red and white. So definitely very interesting. And just, I mean, it was so interesting when I read this because, it talked about the red and white being locked in a final battle, and so we see, kind of the Super Bowl picture of this battle, and what's exciting is that the red, which is the picture of a reawakening, and, you know, coming out of hibernation and, you know, we saw how the red team, the people that wore the red jersey, won at the end. And so definitely very interesting. And what's interesting too is, so, it was interesting that the Seders happened at nightfall. And so the Super Bowl game was, happened in the evening and then, or early evening. And then, talk about it being well lit with candles. Well, so what's interesting about the candles too is that, this was also the date of the Candlemas, which is a Catholic holiday. And we'll actually get into that because there's a connection with Candlemas and Groundhog Day. So that was interesting. And just the whole idea of the awakening and the hibernation, that connects to the groundhog too. And so we'll get into that. Okay, and I also thought what was interesting too was just continuing to look at these numbers. I wrote down while the game was going on, I kind of wrote down the various scores, and it was interesting because, for the longest time there was the 20 points from the 49ers. And so when you looked on the screen, it was like you saw 2016, and then it was like you saw 2017. And then we went on and saw 2023, 2024, 2030, and 2031. I was thinking we would see 2020, but we didn't see that. But I highlighted 2016 and 2017 because what's significant about those years is that on the calendar is that was the transition from Obama to Trump. So I thought that was very interesting. And then when you look at the final score, the 31, you could break that up to be 24 plus 7. So obviously we already talked about 7, and then 24 is a number that's showing up a lot lately. And I think it's really significant. And what was interesting with that 24 too is that we saw the most valuable player, he was a 24-year-old, and then his number also was number 15. and that connects to the story of Genesis, where the flood, I think, goes up to 15 cubits high. And so we see that in the picture of that. And the 24 connects to, so I've been reading, I've talked about the 21 and the 24 that we see in the book of Daniel, where he's mourning for 3 weeks, and then on the 24th he sees like a messianic figure. And I really always kind of read that and just really thought the messianic figure was a picture of Jesus. But then if you read it more closely, at the beginning of his encounter with this messianic figure, he actually falls into kind of a deep sleep. And so I think what we're seeing in that story of Daniel is that Daniel is actually seeing someone who looks like a messianic figure, or what we're seeing is shadows of, first there's a messianic type figure that shows up that causes Daniel to fall into a deep sleep. And then the real messianic figure comes and awakens him. So what we're seeing is kind of like death and resurrection in that story. And then we saw 24, has been talked about a lot because of the helicopter crash with Kobe Bryant. He was number 24. So I definitely think, God's wanting to emphasize that number right now. And then, so then I talked about the Kansas City Chiefs, 50 years since they've been in the Super Bowl. So that 5 is definitely a messianic number because that connects to the tribe of Judah. And then the Chiefs coach, Andy Reid. So what was very interesting is that he had 221 victories before the Super Bowl and 222 victories after. And so I highlighted kind of the 21 part because, so it's interesting that there was a lot of 2s on this day because it was 2/2/2020. So that, like I said, 2 relates to the 2 witnesses. The 21, we talked about kind of the meaning of 21 and 777. And so what we're seeing with his victory in the Super Bowl is kind of this transition from the 21, sort of like the time of Trump and Netanyahu, into the time of 222, 22, which could be a picture of the time of Obama. So a transition there. And then, okay, so let's talk about the commercials that happened during the Super Bowl. So, obviously when I was watching it, I was looking for, kind of the apocalyptic type commercials. I actually thought there was more last year than this year with the commercials in the Super Bowl. But, we still had a few. And so one of the commercials that we saw a couple times during the game was, there's this TV show called 9/11 Lone Star, which is, about like emergency services in Texas. And so they had an episode coming up the next day on 2/3, where there was a tornado that hit. And so that was definitely, definitely apocalyptic looking. What's very interesting too is the episode was called Act of God. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then what was interesting too was McDonald's had a commercial where they showed a bunch of different meals, and one of the persons that they brought up was Marty McFly, which is from Back to the Future. And I don't know if I've ever talked about this in my videos, but people have discussed the 9/11 connections in Back to the Future in the original, the first movie, because one of the pictures is when when Marty goes to the mall the first time to meet the doctor. It's called the Twin Pines Mall. And then when he's in the past, he ends up running over one of the pines, and so then it becomes the Lone Pine Mall. And so that is definitely a 9/11 connection, because we have the twin towers that turn into the one tower. And then the other thing that's interesting too is that um, he's at the mall. I'm trying to think how this works. There's something like he's at the mall at what is it, 211, and then if you turn it upside down, oh, I don't remember how it works, but the time that he was at the mall, if you turn it upside down, looks like 9/11. And so that's the 9/11 connections from Back to the Future. What was interesting too is there was a Doritos commercial where they had in the Wild Wild West, and they were dancing in the Wild Wild West. So that actually kind of connects to Back to the Future, the third movie. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then, another really interesting commercial that we saw was, there was a commercial with Planters Mr. Peanut. And so the commercial that they actually showed before the Super Bowl was Mr. Peanut actually dies. Like, he ends up sacrificing his life to save the life of his two friends. He ends up falling into the Grand Canyon and dying. And so then they have a commercial where they're having a funeral for him, and the person's tears fall, and then he Mr. Peanut gets resurrected into Baby Peanut, like he comes up out of the ground. So definitely some very messianic shadows there, of resurrection, of coming out of the ground. And then what's very interesting too is he takes the Baby Peanut, which is really cute, and he holds it up like the Lion King, at the end of the commercial, the same pose of holding up the Lion King to present the king to the people, and so definitely very interesting. Definitely very many messianic shadows in that commercial. And then, kind of a weird commercial. They talked about how bad the world is, which it is, by the way. But their solution was, we're going to fix the world by feeding it a Snickers. And they have this giant, what's interesting to me is the giant hole that they have is kind of like this God-shaped hole. Like, only God could really fill this hole. But they try to put a Snicker in it to fix the world. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And so, people that maybe don't even follow God, they're sensing that things are wrong with the world. So that was kind of interesting. And then what was interesting too was we saw Tom Brady, who, I think he came out of last year's Super Bowl, and they were calling him the GOAT last year. And so we kind of saw him again in a commercial this year. And what was interesting is that the commercial, they made it seem like he was going to retire, but then he they made it seem like he was going to make an announcement that he was going to retire, but he didn't. And ended up selling whatever it was he was selling, Infinity or whatever it was. So what's interesting about him too is that besides being the GOAT, he has 6 Super Bowl wins. So we see that number 6 connected to him. There was another commercial, just, so I'm kind of thinking there was some Antichrist connections here, with Tom Brady being the GOAT. That's a connection to Obama, the Antichrist. And then we also saw Marvel's had a very creepy Black Widow, commercial, for their new show coming up, and that's definitely connections to the Antichrist. I thought it was interesting too. One of the commercials had "Let It Go" from Frozen. So I already talked about how the recent Frozen movie, the sequel is called Frozen 2, but the way they write it, it's like Frozen 11. And so we see kind of connections to the winter judgment season. And then like the 11, connects to judgment, because 9/11, was a day of judgment. So I thought that was interesting. And then to me, what was interesting too, so one of the commercials that we actually saw a lot of was this Tide commercial where this guy got a stain on his shirt, and everyone was telling him to clean it later. And then at the very end, near the end of the Super Bowl, there's a commercial where, he's old and his friend's old, and he says he got his shirt clean because it's later. And so I highlighted that because I think that was a prophetical statement. It's later. And so if we're not aware of that we're in the last days, then we wouldn't even pay attention to what he's saying. But to me, it's very prophetical because it's later. And then what was very interesting too was the numbers. So supposedly there were 62 Super Bowl ads. So that is very interesting because that connects to the Groundhog Day stuff, and we'll talk about that next. And then what was interesting, so Donald Trump had a political ad. It finished last, and so it finished 60 seconds. So I thought that was very prophetical because I see the 62 this that comes out of the book of Daniel connecting to Donald Trump. Okay, so then the top Super Bowl ad ended up being Jeep's Groundhog Day commercial. So what was very interesting is that the Groundhog Day ended up falling on the same day as Super Bowl, or Super Bowl ended up falling on the same day as Groundhog Day. And so one of the things that was talked a lot about was the date, the 02/02/2020. And so one of the things that was said about it is that this is the first global palindrome day in 909 years. Now, I'm not sure that's even really accurate, but it was interesting that it was being talked about like that. Because what's interesting about it is, so they talked about the date. The reason why they call it a global palindrome is that the date is, it works in Europe too, because, or in the places where they, where they switch. We do the month first and then the day, and then I guess in European countries they list it the other way. And so they were saying that the date would be the same, no matter where you are in the world. And so that's what they mean by global. And so that was very interesting. And it is interesting that it's, this the same from front to, from the front to the back, moving inward. That palindrome in the date. And then, and lots of twos, and so I think that kind of relates to the two witnesses. It's kind of interesting to me because I'll get into this later, but it was, this was the start of what I consider this second week thing that I wanted to talk about. And then, so the one thing they talked about too was the fact that Groundhog Day fell on the same day as Super Bowl. They mentioned how that only happened twice in the 54 years of the Super Bowl. And so the chief marketing officer of, the Jeep company, he actually made the point about how he said the fact that these 2 days coincided only twice in 54 years. He said it's like Halley's Comet or something. So I thought that was a real prophetical statement because I think it's really true that the fact that these lined up, because I think God was trying to say something about Groundhog Day falling on with the Super Bowl. Like he was trying to get, like, obviously the Super Bowl has a lot of people watch it, and it gets a lot of attention. And so I think God was taking advantage of this opportunity, to really make a statement. And then what was interesting, the Jeep Super Bowl commercial was 60 seconds long, which I guess means they paid twice the amount for it. And what's interesting too in the commercial, it comes from the Groundhog Day movie, and what we're seeing in the commercial is the clock switching from 5:59 to 6 o'clock, and so I highlighted the sixes. So we're seeing a lot of six. So definitely very interesting. What's interesting was the commercial was made 27 years later than the original Groundhog Day movie. Um, and so 27, I think, is a picture of resurrection. Um, so I thought that was kind of interesting because it was, kind of interesting. Like we, are seeing the character from Groundhog Day resurrected in this commercial. Um, because he coming back after 27 years. And then um, what I thought was really interesting is, and unfortunately I couldn't find this. I wanted to find this on the internet, but they didn't put it on the Jeep YouTube channel. Um, but what they showed, because what they put on the Jeep YouTube channel was they put a lot of teasers where game day, where they talks about game day being Super Bowl day, um, you know, and um, and so that's what ends up on the channel. But actually, on the day of the Super Bowl, so what you saw in the commercial was the clock changing to 6 a.m. and then just like in the movie, and then uh it was a teaser, so you got kind of a picture of like, oh, this looks like Groundhog Day the movie. And then what they put on the screen was America Get Ready. um and so I really wanted to um get a copy of that because um I really think that was kind of a statement from God, because I do think that he's saying something with the Groundhog Day. um and I think that God is saying that we need to get ready, because I think judgment is about to come. um and so that was very interesting, the teaser. And then what was interesting, the full commercial aired late in the fourth quarter, so that's definitely significant. And then they had another teaser too, which I thought was another prophetical statement, where it says this Sunday is going to be a doozy. Um, Ned, the character Ned Ryerson said that. And so obviously he was talking about the Super Bowl, but I kind of wonder if it's a prophetical shadow of, maybe to be Shabbat, like, maybe it's a shadow of how the New Year for trees is going to be a doozy, which is the Sunday that comes after the Super Bowl. So that remains to be seen, of what that could be a prophetic shadow of. Okay. And then so let's talk about the actual commercial itself. Just a few things that came out of the commercial. It was kind of interesting because if you watch the extended version of the commercial, it was interesting because he was trying to bring the groundhog into the restaurant. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because, I mean, at first when I saw it, I thought he was trying to take the groundhog into the inn, and they said there was no room for animals. And so at first I was gonna write, oh, no room for groundhog in the inn, which obviously connects to there was no room for Jesus when he was born in the inn. But when I watched it again, it was like, oh, it's not the inn, it's a restaurant. But it still kind of works. No room for the groundhog in the inn. But then he ends up putting, you got to watch it because it's hilarious. He ends up putting a support vest on the groundhog, and then they let him bring him in. So that was funny. And then what we see in the groundhog commercial is definitely a repeat of the winter theme. He's driving around a lot in the Jeep with snow on the ground. What's interesting too is that he's driving in a Jeep with no door. And then Farmer Bob in the commercial says, you're going to freeze to death. And then Bill Murray says, well, who cares? And so I thought that was interesting because I see this picture of, okay, so what I see with winter is that winter is a picture of judgment. And then what's interesting is he's in the Jeep with no door. Okay, so we know that Jesus is the door. And so if you don't have the door, you are going to freeze to death. And so I think that was a very prophetical, picture. Like, message from God, is what I think. Like, you want the door, or you're going to freeze to death, or judgment is going to come to you. And then just another picture of the winter theme. So, when the clock goes off and the radio comes on, it says, "Okay, campers, rise and shine. It's Groundhog Day. And don't forget your booties because it's cold out there today." And so we definitely see this picture of winter kind of being like brought in with this Groundhog Day. And so we'll talk more about that. And then what was interesting too in this commercial is like there was a new thing was introduced into the Groundhog Day movie picture, and it was this Jeep Gladiator. And what's interesting is what they say about it is that there's only one. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because I kind of see like a messianic picture of like this new thing is going to be introduced into this, the Groundhog Day, the winter, the exile, the eternal exile. And it's this, this thing that there's only one of, so obviously that's a connection to the Messiah. There's only one Messiah, that's going to be introduced, and it ends up, the Jeep Gladiator ends up bringing joy to Bill Murray. So just like Jesus is going to come and bring joy to us. So let's talk about the movie, because if you understand the messianic shadows in the movie, then you'll see, how like being reminded of this movie on Groundhog Day was very interesting. So what's interesting in the movie is that you have Bill Murray played Phil Connors. And so what's interesting is his first name is the same as the groundhog. And he has the same name as the groundhog, Phil. And so it's like the groundhog is a messianic figure, and then the Phil Connors, played by Bill Murray, is a messianic type figure. And then what's interesting is that Phil Connors has the same story as the groundhog. Phil Connors is stuck in an eternal winter, for at least 10 years until he emerges as a better person. So like, it could kind of be, so it was interesting because I read about this, that Harold Ramis that directed the movie, they asked him, well, how long was he, stuck in this Groundhog Day? And I didn't realize like it was, he came up with 10 years, and then later he actually changed that to say, well, maybe it's even longer, because to learn how to do all that stuff, you need more than 10 years. But it was interesting that he picked that 10-year time frame, because, I think that's the time of the tribulation period, the tribulation for God's people. So, definitely seeing a picture of like God's people stuck in eternal winter, for 10 years, but also the Messiah being kind of stuck in an eternal winter for 10 years, and then Phil Connors is a messianic figure. He ends up saving the town at the end of the movie, by doing all these things to all the various people. And then, obviously the movie and the story of Phil Connors is all connected, all surrounds Groundhog's Day. And then, so we'll talk about the day, Groundhog Day. So what's interesting about Groundhog Day is that it happens on February 2nd. And there is a connection with Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day is actually like the American Candlemas. And so, so like over in Europe, they celebrated Candlemas. But then, kind of when the holiday came over here, and like the Catholics actually call Groundhog Day like the Protestants' Candlemas, so just kind of interesting how things kind of evolved over time, and and as and how they changed too when they came overseas, so let me read about, so let's study Candlemas, because it's a very interesting day. So Candlemas Day is another name for the feast of the presentation of the Lord. 40 days after his birth, Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple for the rites of purification and dedication as prescribed by the Torah. According to the book of Leviticus, when a woman bore a male child, she was considered unclean for 7 days. On the 8th day, the boy was circumcised. The mother continued to stay at home for 33 days for her blood to be purified. After the 40 days, the mother and father came to the temple for the rite of purification, which included the offering of a sacrifice, a lamb for a holocaust or burnt offering, and a pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. Or for a poor couple who could not afford a lamb, 2 pigeons or 2 turtle doves. Note, Joseph and Mary made the offering of the poor. Okay, and that comes from Luke 2:24. So reading on, so the presentation is a proclamation of Christ, Messiah and priest, Lord and Savior. He is the light who came into this world to dispel sin and darkness. For this reason, traditionally, at least since the 7th century, candles have been blessed at Mass this day that will be used throughout the year, hence coining the term Candlemas. In many Eastern European countries, the Feast of the Presentation officially closes the celebration of Christmas. For this reason, John Paul II began the custom of keeping the nativity scene in St. Peter's Square until February 2nd. Candlemas Day was also important in the lives of farmers. An old English song went as follows: If Candlemas be fair and bright, come winter have another flight. If Candlemas brings clouds and rain, go winter and come not again. So if the bright sun overshadows the brightness of Candlemas Day, there will be more winter. However, if the light of Candlemas Day radiates through the gloom and darkness of the day, the end of winter is near. Okay, and that's all from CatholicStraightAnswers.com on Candlemas Day. So definitely wanted to emphasize that it happens 40 days after Christmas. And what I thought was interesting was, when they referred to the verses in Leviticus, reminded of the 7 days when, so she bores a male child and she's considered unclean for 7 days. So I thought the 7 days was interesting because of the week that started with Candlemas or Groundhog Day was a very significant week. And so I wanted to talk about that. Keep in mind that it was considered unclean. And then it talks about on the 8th day, the boy was circumcised. So we see a picture of like the cutting off on the 8th day. And then the mother needing to be purified for 33 more days. And then they talked about when they came to the temple, I thought it was very interesting that they called the burnt offering, they used this word holocaust. Definitely interesting, a little disturbing, but definitely could be prophetical in a scary way. And then what I thought was interesting too, I wanted to emphasize the candles that are blessed, because I've talked about in my previous video how I think we're in this multiple Hanukkah cycle. And so, candles would connect to the Hanukkah picture. So it's always interesting to me when I see the various religions, the ones that follow God overlapping, when we see Christianity kind of connecting into Judaism and vice versa. So definitely very interesting. So then we'll talk about Groundhog Day, because that came out of the candle winter aspect of Candlemas. Okay, they used a different animal in Europe, but the groundhog has some similarities to Jesus. He goes into hibernation in the late fall, which is a picture of like Jesus in the tomb, and then he emerges from his burrow in February like a resurrection. Okay, what's interesting is the full name of the groundhog in Punxsutawney Pennsylvania is Puxatani Phil, seer of seers, sages of sages, prognosticator of prognosticators, and weather prophet extraordinary. So I wrote, that's a lot of pressure on this poor little groundhog. Only Jesus can be considered the sages of sages and seers of seers. But so what's interesting is just we see how he's like this messianic figure. Seer of seers, that's a prophetic, that's like, and they call him a weather prophet too, and so we definitely see, that he's seen as like a prophetic, he's seen as like a prophet. He's going to tell us what's going to happen in the weather. And so on February 2nd, when the groundhog is said to come out of his hole at the end of hibernation, if the animal sees his shadow, i.e., if the weather is sunny, it is said to portend 6 more weeks of winter weather. Okay, so I highlighted the 6 and I highlighted the 2 because I think there's a lot of connections of 62 and 6-2 to Candlemas. And then what's interesting is like this year in Puxatani, so one of the things they do is they have the groundhog is kind of like in this tree stump, kind of sort of, that has a door on it. And so they go and they'll knock, during the ceremony, they go and they knock on the door 3 times. Then they unlock the door. And then there's 2 scrolls. They pull out the groundhog and they put him up on this platform. And there's 2 scrolls, and one of them talks about winter and one of them talks about spring. So actually it was funny, the previous tradition was that the groundhog would like talk to one of the men and tell him whether it's going to be winter or spring, whether he saw his shadow or not. I mean, it's interesting to me because I don't know why they just don't look and see if you could see the groundhog shadow or not. But it's like they're trying to get the groundhog to tell us whether he could see his shadow. And so they used to have this tradition that the groundhog would like whisper in the guy's ear and then the guy would tell us what the groundhog said. Kind of a weird tradition. But now they've changed it to like they have these 2 scrolls and they put the groundhog up in the platform. And I mean, this year was weird. I don't know if like they're expecting the groundhog to pick a scroll and then that's the one they'll read. Or, I mean, this year they just kind of, they were like asking the groundhog, so which scroll is it? Which one? Is it the one near you? And then they just kind of pushed the one, near him to read, and so then they read that one, and this year they declared that spring was coming. They declared it was going to be an early spring. Well, so it was very interesting when they said that. It was snowing at the time when he was reading the scroll. So I thought that was an interesting message from God because I really don't think it's going to be an early spring for people that don't follow God. So let's talk about the prophetic connections of this day. So I think it's very interesting that it's, they talk about the end of hibernation of the groundhog. So I think that's a picture of the end of the tribulation period for God's people. And then obviously the start of it, it wouldn't be the end of tribulation for people that don't follow God. It would be the start of wrath for God's people. And I talked about connections to 6 and 2, which is Daniel's 62nd week. And then what we see is the animal seeing its shadow. If the animal sees its shadow, then it means that there's 6 more weeks of winter. So one thing I'd like to propose is that what if the shadow is like a picture of, so we have this groundhog being a messianic type figure, and then he's seeing a shadow, which could be a picture of like, he's seeing like another groundhog, a dark groundhog. And so I think what we're seeing is like this picture of, if the groundhog is a picture of the Messiah, if the Messiah comes out and he sees his shadow, if he sees someone who's claiming to look like the Messiah, then there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter weather. And so I'd like to propose that we're in that day where if the Messiah comes out now, he's going to see Donald Trump, acting as like a messianic figure. And so then what we're going to see is 6 more weeks of winter weather, which is winter judgment for those with the mark of the beast. And it's interesting too that it's like 6 weeks, the 6 connects to the 666 mark of the beast. And it was interesting that they knocked on the door 3 times, and so I think that connects to the 3 angels in Revelation, that come out and prophesy judgment for Babylon. One of them preaches the gospel, but one of them talks about judgment for Babylon. And then it was interesting that they unlocked the door for the groundhog. So I see that as the picture of like God decides when tribulation is over, and we need God to come and unlock the door of tribulation. And then I thought it was interesting with the 2 scrolls that said winter or spring, because what I really think is that both are true, and what it depends on is that what I think it connects to is that it's going to be spring when the Messiah comes. He is going to declare spring for his people. It's going to be a reversal of fortunes, and Joseph gets out of jail, or God's people get out of jail, while God's enemies, they enter winter. They enter judgment. So with both the scrolls, it's kind of interesting because they're both going to be true. Okay, and so I wanted to talk about kind of the patterns that I've been seeing. I tried to make this video a little shorter because I can go into great detail about patterns and the calendar and everything that's going on. But I'll try to be a little briefer in this video. And I already talked about this in the last video, that I felt like we were in this pattern of multiple Hanukkah weeks. And so we had December 22nd was Hanukkah Eve, so kind of the start of it all. And so then I listed, I went through, in the last video, I went through the 5 Hanukkahs, and then now I think we moved into a 6th Hanukkah that was, is from February 1st to February 8th. And what's interesting to me was that Groundhog Day was on the 2nd day of this Hanukkah 6. So we see a repeat of the number 6 and the number 2. So definitely very interesting. And then I wanted to list, I did go through, because I realized with Hanukkah 5, with the 5th Hanukkah week, that that was when the deal of the century was released by Trump, and the supposed peace deal, and and it happened on day 5, and I have been following just day 3 and day 8, and so I thought it would be helpful to go through what happened on day 5 of the various Hanukkahs. And so in the first Hanukkah week, on day 5, that was when Netanyahu won the Likud primary, and then he vowed to finalize the borders. Also very interesting, that was the day that the U.S. contractor was killed in Iraq, which was interesting because that was the start of kind of America's clashes with Iran, that could have blew up into war, but fortunately didn't. But that was very interesting. And then day 5 of the 2nd Hanukkah was when Trump mentioned the 52 Iranian sites, when he was still in the middle of those clashes with Iran, and he said he was going to attack 52 sites. And then day 5, so it was interesting because you see kind of a repeat of the 5 and the 2, because it's the day 5 on Hanukkah 2. So I thought that was interesting. And then in the 3rd Hanukkah week on day 5, it was Winter Storm Isaiah, which had 11 which was very prophetical, pretty significant, because we saw 11 deaths in that storm. I don't know if that was the total, but on day 5 was when they mentioned 11 deaths, and there was 11 tornadoes in 11 states. And I mean, I think that happened over a 5 day period. But that was definitely very interesting. So we see that number 11 of judgment with this winter storm Isaiah. And then obviously Isaiah, just using that name Isaiah, we see this picture of judgment, because Isaiah was definitely a prophet that came and announced judgment. So then for Hanukkah 4, not too much happened on day 5, at least as far as I could tell. Just it was the 3-year after Trump's inauguration date, and then it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And then for Hanukkah 5, was on day 5, that, like I said, that was the day of the deal of the century. And then what was very interesting too was that was the day that Netanyahu got formally indicted on corruption charges. So definitely very interesting. That's why I wanted to look at the other day 5s, because I thought it was interesting that connected to, we had a day 5 where Netanyahu won in the Likud primary, and then, a couple weeks later he gets indicted. So very interesting. And then, so let's talk about Hanukkah 6. So that happened this past week, February 1st to February 8th. So like I said, day 2 was Groundhog Day, Super Bowl Sunday. So day 4, and I just listed day 4. I wasn't following day 4s, but I thought day 4 was very significant, so I wrote it down, which was the State of the Union speech. And then day 5 was when we saw Trump was acquitted. So definitely interesting, because we had, that connects to the day 5 where Netanyahu won the Likud primary, and then connects to the day 5 in Hanukkah 5 where Netanyahu was formally indicted, and then we have Trump being acquitted. So definitely very interesting. On day 8, which is today, February 8th. Oh, interesting. I didn't even see the repeat of the 8. So what I thought was interesting is that you could call this a winter Sabbath. And so I wanted to propose, because what we had was on January 26th in Israel, they call that the end of winter in Israel. But what we have is the Groundhog Day coming a week later, where the groundhog declares 6 more weeks of winter. And so you could say that even though winter was over in Israel, and actually there's another season, and I talk about that on another slide, in Israel, but we could have the groundhog, declaring this Sabbath to be a winter Sabbath. So we're looking for a winter Sabbath because Jesus says, pray that your flight doesn't happen in winter or on a Sabbath. So definitely kind of interesting, because especially since tonight at midnight is the super snow moon. And there's kind of a debate whether it's a super moon or not. And so it depends who you listen to. But definitely very interesting, because we get that snow picture again, so just a repeat of the winter picture. Okay, so then next week would be the start of Hanukkah 7, and that starts on February 9th and then goes to February 16th. What's interesting about that is that on day 2 is Tu B'Shabbat, the New Year for trees. And so then what I wanted to talk about was in Daniel 9. So it says, in Daniel 9, it says, so you are to know and discern that from an issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So, obviously, I believe in multiple fulfillments of prophecy. I think God's word is very rich. I think we see multiple fulfillments. And so we've always looked at this verse, and we talked about maybe an issuing a decree would have been in 1948 or 47. But I took a new look at this verse and connected it to, it's well, what if this connects to the deal of the century? And so what we had was on January 28th, was Trump issued a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem with this deal of the century. Is that not true? And and kind of when it talks about like rebuilding Jerusalem, it's like rebuilding East Jerusalem. So it's a capital for the Palestinians. So it was kind of interesting of um, you know, how there could be a connection. I mean, it's just interesting. I mean, and so when you think about like a decree restoring Jerusalem, what we see with Trump is he's making promises that it would bring peace to Israel. That this, if people went through the deal of the century, it would create peace. So kind of restore it and make it better. So kind of interesting. And then so what it says is after this issuing of this decree, there's going to be 7 weeks and 62 weeks before we see Messiah the Prince, which could be a picture of the Messiah Jesus that we're looking for. And so we're looking for 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And then, it's interesting that it says it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So I thought it was interesting that, like, if you think about like the deal of the century being another two-state solution, so you could read this verse and say it will be built again. The two-state solution is showing up again, but this time it's got plaza and moat. And so that's why everybody's all excited, because they're saying, hey, this is the peace deal that will actually bring peace to Israel, because Trump actually considered the security, the moat aspect of, I mean, it's so interesting how this connects, because they're saying Trump actually considered the moat, the aspect, or the protection and security of Israel. And then he also considered the plaza. He's not giving them the main part of Jerusalem, just the east part of Jerusalem, so kind of interesting. And then it's interesting that it mentions even in times of distress. So it's interesting when you think about Trump's deal of the century, that you've had Trump building this deal of the century in times of distress, that and even creating more distress with his declarations of moving the embassy and making acknowledging the Golan Heights and acknowledging the West Bank, if I got those right. So definitely that all happened in times of distress. This deal of the century was the two-state solution being built again, being created again, even in times of distress. So definitely interesting. And then so I want to propose that maybe the 7 weeks could connect to the 7th Hanukkah, February 9th to February 16th. And then the 62 weeks could connect to the 2 weeks before the 7th Hanukkah. So I talked about how we see 62 showing up a lot on Groundhog Day. And so I want to propose that maybe the 62 weeks, one of the weeks of these 2 weeks, connects to Groundhog Day with the 6 and the 2. And then just another possible prophetic connection with this Daniel 9 verse. It says, it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. We also can see a connection to when Trump made his State of the Union address. Once again, he brought up the wall, and how he plans to want to, keep building the wall on the southern border. And then, and then what's interesting is like, it will be built again. What we saw was the day after the State of the Union address was Trump being acquitted. So kind of like a rebuilding of, now we're back to normal, after the impeachment trial. So definitely can see a connection there. Like the plaza could be a picture of the city, so the city or the government or, the the center of business being built again, so Trump being restored to his position, to be president. And so talking about us, okay, so let's talk about these 2 weeks. Let's see. Okay, so I threw in the other verses. So it says, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah or the anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay. So I already talked about the 7th week, 7 weeks connecting possibly to the 7th Hanukkah, which would be February 9th to February 16th, with the New Year for trees falling on day 2 of that Hanukkah. And so then I'm wondering if what we have is 2 weeks, and these would be 2 7-day weeks, not like Hanukkah weeks of 8 days, but these are 2 weeks before the 7th Hanukkah. Would be week 1 would be January 26th to February 1st, and then week 2 would be February 2nd to February 8th. So I think it's really significant. What I'm seeing is some very interesting prophetic connections between the 2 weeks that connect to these verses in Daniel. And so what we saw on January 26th, so I mentioned how that's the end of the rainy winter in Israel. But there's actually another winter season or cold season that comes in Israel that doesn't have rain in it, that's coming up. And what I thought was interesting was January 26th has the number 2 and the number 6 in the date. So I thought that was very interesting. We see this pattern where in the middle of the week, we see, okay, so on January 28th was when, and we knew this was a very prophetical week, because this was when Trump released his deal of the century. And so I want to propose that could be a picture of, it says in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And so what I think is that we're seeing the fulfillment of this verse in 2 weeks. That in the first week was a stop to sacrifice, and put quotes around stop to sacrifice. And then in the second week, we see a stop to grain offering. Because one of the things that I want to propose is that what we saw is that we saw the mess. Okay, so I think we're going to see, multiple fulfillments of this verse, of the 1 week. And what we're going to see is that first we had the false messianic figure come and propose, like supposedly put a stop to sacrifice. And then what we're going to see is Jesus comes and he's going to fulfill the verse more fully, where he's actually going to bring a true stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay. And then, so what we saw was on January 28th, like I said, the deal of the century was released. And so what you could say was, here was Trump's plan to supposedly, quote unquote, bring peace to Israel, bring a stop to the ongoing sacrifice of the Jewish people in the land, by the terrorists that surround it. And, so that's the false fulfillment, the false Messiah trying to bring a stop to sacrifice. What was interesting on that date too was that was when Netanyahu was formally indicted. Very important date. The next day, okay, so I want to talk about the next day, because on January 29th, Netanyahu did an interview on Fox. And he actually used words peace and security. Let me read to you what he said, because this is just incredible. So I wanted to quote him directly so you don't think I'm making this stuff up. Okay, so here's a direct quote. Trump's Middle East peace plan is an opportunity of a lifetime for Israel and the Palestinians and for peace. Okay, circle peace there. Okay, so then, and then it said Netanyahu called Trump the best friend that Israel has ever had in the White House. So he said that, and then he went on to say President Trump has brought forward a peace plan that enables us to make a deal of the century. It gives Israel security. It gives the Palestinians national dignity. It allows us to move forward so that we can live together. So can you see he actually used the words peace and security in that interview? So just very fascinating that he said all that. So that was the first week, and then we saw kind of a similar repeat in week 2 of things that happened. So like I said, on February 2nd was Groundhog Day, so a repeat of those 2 and the 6 numbers. And then in the middle of the week, so on February 4th, was when Trump had his State of the Union address. And really, when you listen to him, he was painting this picture of like this messianic vision for America, and just really talked about how life was going to be great in America, and how he was going to bring about peace for America and security, and how the environment was good. I mean, just really painted a nice rosy picture of where America is at today and where it's going. So definitely, if you listen to it, it was definitely kind of this messianic rose-colored glasses picture of America. And then it was very interesting, because like I said, on February 5th, the next day was when he was acquitted. And so we saw like a stop to the grain offering, where if the grain is a picture of the Christians in America, with Trump being acquitted, it was like they put a stop to, either, offering up Trump as a grain, an Omer offering, or, offering up, you could say they were offering up the American political system as an offering to their gods. Okay. So then I wanted to talk about too. So I also see in scripture, I talked about this before, a bunch of 3 days followed by 3 days, then a third day. Okay, so what we saw was in the book of Esther, Esther talks about having the Jews fast for 3 days, night or day, and then Esther and her maidens will fast in the same way. And then Esther goes to the king on the third day. And then we see a similar pattern with the 2 in prison with Joseph. There's 3 days of the cupbearer and 3 days of the baker, and then the third day is Pharaoh's birthday. So we're kind of a similar pattern repeated. And then we also see the similar pattern in the sign of Jonah. And so it says, okay, so the scribes and the Pharisees said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, "An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Okay. So I wanted to talk about these verses in Matthew 12 because so what we have is like Jonah being in the belly of the sea monster for 3 days and 2 nights, and then we have the Son of Man being 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Okay. So what if Jonah is a picture of Netanyahu or Israel, and they are spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of Trump, and or Netanyahu in the belly of Trump. Okay, so I found this verse in Ezekiel 32 where you can see the sea monster being Trump. So it says, Son of Man. So put quotes around Son of Man. This guy pretending to be the Son of Man. Take up a lamentation over Pharaoh. Oh, wait, actually, that might actually really be the Son of Man. Um, take up a lamentation. So this is actually maybe God talking to Jesus saying, take up a lamentation over Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Okay, so Pharaoh. And say to him, you compared yourself to young lion of the nations, yet you are like the monster in the seas, and you burst forth in your rivers, and muddied the waters with your feet, and fouled their rivers. Okay, so, so if Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is a picture of Trump, he compared himself to a young lion of the nations, which would be like comparing himself to a messianic figure. And then it says, but you are like the monster in the seas. So like the sea monster. So, okay, and then we see the Son of Man being 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so Trump, okay, so here's where I want to put quotes around the Son of Man. Trump is like the Son of Man, and the earth is America. So America is spending 3 days and 3 nights or let's see, how does it say it? The Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So we have this false messianic figure in the heart of the earth, in the heart of America. Okay. So, okay, so let's see. Okay, so on this verse, okay. Okay, so, let's see, did I skip a slide? No. Okay. So if we talk about the second week is February 2nd to February 8th, where I talked about where Trump was acquitted, what I mentioned before was how it's a picture of a stop to grain offering. And so what we could see with the 2 in prison with Joseph, this would be the 3 days where the cupbearer was set free. Okay. So wine, connecting to the American Christians. And then, let's see. So I don't understand. Let's see. Okay, for some reason I didn't bring up the week. Oh, okay, that's why. Okay, so then what the pattern is that we have, 3 days where the cupbearer is set free, and then 3 days later is, and then there's another 3 days where the baker actually is loses his position and actually gets hung on a tree. And so 3 days later after Trump's acquittal would be the first Groundhog winter Sabbath. I don't know if it would happen that quickly, but there's going to be some other 3-day time frame, following Trump's acquittal. Let's see, we could sort of see a partial fulfillment of the baker where, actually on the 3rd day of, so like the 3rd day of that first week, January 26th to the February 1st, we saw Netanyahu get formally indicted, so we kind of see a little bit of a picture of him getting hung on a tree. But then, I think the part where the birds eat the bread out of the basket is still to be. There's still a 3 days coming where that's going to happen. I'm kind of wondering, one picture that I'm looking at too is, so we see today's 13 of Shabbat, and then on February 10th is the 15th of Shabbat. Which, it's actually, well, whatever, like today's, so we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th of Shabbat. um, on the 10th of February is the 13-year anniversary of when Obama declared that he was going to run for president. And so I kind of wonder if we have 3 days right here, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th could be 3 days that connect to the Antichrist. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. So that's one possibility. We see another 13, 14, and 15 just coming up in, okay, so the reason why I mentioned 13, 14, and 15 is that shows up in the book of Esther, where there's fighting on the first 2 days and people resting on the 15th. So we see February 13, 14, and 15 are coming up, so those are possible, watch dates to look at. What I think is interesting is that in the book of Esther, we have people that rest on the 14th and then people that rest on the 15th. What's very interesting about that is that Trump's birthday is on, I think it's the month of June 14. And so we see 14 connected to Trump. And then, so what I'm wondering is what we're seeing is kind of the shadow of, we have people that rest on the 14th would be a picture of the people that rest in Trump, like take on the mark, and take on the mark of the beast, and they look at him like a messianic figure. And so then, but what we're going to have is a group of people that are actually not going to rest on the 14th. They're going to rest on the 15th. And so I think the 15th would be a picture of the Messiah. Because we see like 555, connected to 15. It's interesting that 2 Bay Shabbat is on the 15th of Shabbat. I don't know if things are going to happen this quickly. We'll see what happens on that date, but I'm also looking at February 15th as a possible watch date, which is a Sabbath, which is kind of interesting. But then we could also see with that date where you have the 15th to the 21st of February being, like a Passover, Sukkot type week. And then, maybe looking for the Messiah to show up on either the 22nd, the 23rd, or the 24th, being like 8/1, 8/2, and 8/3, as possible dates. Also, what's coming up is February 27th is the second month, the 27th day of the month, which was in Genesis 8:14. It says the earth was dry on the second month, the 27th day. So that's a possible watch date. It's also the Armenian Candlemas on February 27th. So that would be the absolute last day of, the Christmas season. Because it's the Armenian Candlemas of the Armenians in Jerusalem is the absolute last Christmas, and then this would be 40 days after that. It is interesting too because we have 2 other Candlemasses show up on February 14th and February 15th. So definitely possible watch dates. So let's see. Anyways, and so I wanted to mention that what we have in this picture with Esther, where she talks about the Jews fasting for 3 days, night or day, and then the Esther and her maidens will fast in the same way, is what I want to propose is that when you are fasting, that is what you want to be doing in this season rather than drinking, eating and drinking, okay, like drinking wine. You don't want to be participating in Trump's deal of the century, which would be like eating bread in the Holy Land, causing Jewish people to get killed. You don't want to be drinking in America, like jumping on his bandwagon with his messianic picture of America in the State of the Union. You don't want to be drinking during that time. You want to be fasting and praying. So you don't want to join him in his lies. Okay. And so what we see in this picture of the Jews fasting for 3 days, night or day, is that the Jewish people that are going to follow the true Messiah instead of participating in Trump's deal of the century the first week, which was this last week of January. So the first 3 days, like it says 3 days, night or day, would be like the first 3 days before the 26th, 27th, 28th, before he released the peace deal, would be like a picture of night, quote unquote. And then it's like we see this daytime, the 3 days afterwards, especially with Netanyahu going and, talking about how great Trump is. What we want is the Jewish people to not follow the lies of Trump and Netanyahu, but to fast and pray. So that would happen that week. And then with the Esther and the maidens being a picture of the people in America. And so in the same way, we want God's people to be fasting and not participating in where the first 3 days of this week in February, the second, third, and fourth, would be, like the night, for like Trump's State of the Union, and then the next 3 days, the fifth, sixth, and seventh, would be the celebration days after Trump was acquitted. Okay, we don't want to be participating in that. We want to be fasting. Okay, we want to be sober. We want to be fasting. We don't want to participate in that. And then it talks about so what we saw in the story with Joseph, it talks about the third day being Pharaoh's birthday. So there is one connection. Let me think about this. So I did wonder if a third day was February 10th, because that is a picture of like Obama's birthday, because of being president, because that's when he announced 13 years ago that he was going to be president. But we could also see a third day on February 4th. So I said that was like the third day of that second week. That is actually the half birthday of Obama. And so it's interesting because what happens in the story of Joseph, it talks about on the third day where the head of the cupbearer and the head of the bakers are lifted up. And so that a fulfillment of that could be in Trump's State of the Union address, where where we had Trump was actually like, kind of touting his praises, but also like praising, I think he might have mentioned his son-in-law. I'm not really sure. So the son-in-law could have been the baker. I want to see if this works. I don't know. The third day, February 20 or January 28th, when the deal of the century happened, that could be, I don't know whose birthday that would have been. Like, we could be saying like Pharaoh's birthday, where if you have Pharaoh being the king of Egypt, that you could see that as kind of a picture of Trump, being born as the messianic figure, on that day, the third day of that week, and then obviously the heads that get lifted up is, Trump gets lifted up as a great figure, and Netanyahu gets lifted up as a great figure. So that could be a fulfillment on that day. So we see that happening. Let's see. Okay, so and then I can't remember if I mentioned this, but February 8th, I might already mention this, but I'll mention it again just in case, which is today, is Shabbat Shera, which is where it has to do with the Song of the Sea that we read in the book of Exodus. And so the Shabbat after we read about the Song of the Sea is when they celebrate Shabbat Shera, and one of the traditions is to leave food out for the birds. So I thought that was kind of interesting when you think about the story of the bread being eaten by the birds on the bread maker's basket, the third basket on his head. So kind of interesting. So I thought I mentioned that. So what we also saw was an 8th day and a 7th day too happened these last couple weeks. So in these verses in First Kings, it talks about Solomon observing the feast at that time and all Israel with him, a great assembly from the entrance of Haman to the brook of Egypt before the Lord our God for 7 days and 7 more days, even 14 days. On the 8th day, he sent the people away, and they blessed the king. Then they went to their tents, joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David his servant and to Israel his people. So what's interesting is the 8th day after the deal of the century is February 5th, and that was when Trump was acquitted. So that could be a possible fulfillment. Another 8th day, and always look at multiple fulfillments. Another 8th day could be February 9th or February 10th, where February 10th is actually the 15th of Shabbat. If you have the 14 days being the 14 days of Shabbat, then that would end up, the 15th day would end up on February 10th. So that could be a possible 8th day, where, so we'll see what happens. But I definitely think like Trump being acquitted could be a picture of, the people being sent away, blessing the king, going to their tents joyful. So the tents that they're going in are Trump's tents, instead of the true Messiah's tent. So then we also had a 7th day fulfillment. So the 7th day after the deal of the century was February 4th. What we saw was Nancy Pelosi ripping up the speech at the State of the Union. So let me read these verses in Esther. So it says, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded these 7 eunuchs who serve in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princesses, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry and his wrath burned within him. So I thought it was kind of interesting because when you read this story, it kind of relates to the picture of Haman too, where like good things are happening to Haman, but he still sees Mordecai not, kind of worshiping him at the gate, and so I think we're seeing some fulfillments of that where like Nancy Pelosi, refuses to come, like we saw a bunch of like people at the State of the Union unwilling to, stand up and clap when Trump announced certain things. I mean, we definitely saw the evil of the women in white when they did not stand up when Trump talked about stopping abortion, getting abortion stopped in this country. So I thought that was very evil. Definitely showed the hearts of these women. Anyway, so I saw an interesting connection. Well, so what's interesting in Esther 1 is that the king actually goes on and says, well, what can we do with Vashti because she refused to come? And, so then his advisor said, well, you can get rid of her. And so what's interesting is I think we're seeing a fulfillment of this because Trump is actually starting to fire some people in the White House because of what happened with the impeachment trial and stuff like that. So that's what happened there. So yeah, so it's just kind of interesting, with the Haman chapter, he actually goes and builds a gallows. So it's kind of interesting because if you see Trump as a Haman figure, which I do, it's while he's building this gallows and wanting to hang people on the gallows that he goes in, and then that's when he goes into the king's palace, and then that's when Mordecai actually gets honored. And so we could see this picture of, okay, maybe we're going to see a season of where Trump is going to be firing people, and then in this season, then we'll see the Jesus the Messiah return. So that's a possible fulfillment. So anyways, and so I was looking at So it says about, so in the end of Genesis 40, I think we're seeing the fulfillment of that, where, like I said, the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. So we saw that happen in the State of the Union address. Okay, and then the next verse says he restored the chief cupbearer to his office and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Okay, so we saw Trump was acquitted the next day, February 5th. And then it goes on and it says, but he hanged the chief baker, and so that could be a picture of, Trump firing people that were connected to the impeachment trial. And then it goes on and it says, yet the chief cupbearer who got restored to his office did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Okay, so two things I wanted to bring up as possible fulfillments for that is, one, we definitely see, so Trump has been restored to his office, and then he's not remembering Joseph. So Joseph could be both a picture of the people in Israel, because you know how, like even here, okay, Joseph says, even here I have done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. So that the nation of Israel is getting persecuted. And what we're seeing is that, I really think what we're going to see happen is that, Trump has done his deal of the century, and now he's just going to just go on with his life and ignore all the bad stuff that's going to be happening in Israel. So that's one possible fulfillment. And then the other thing that we saw too was the day after. So he got restored to his office, and then the next day on February 6th was the prayer breakfast. Okay, so if we, talk about Joseph being a messianic figure. Okay, so did we not see Trump not remembering Jesus? So at the prayer breakfast, do you want to talk about yourself and talk about your enemies like Trump did, or do you want to talk about God and Jesus, which is what you should do at a prayer breakfast? But we definitely saw Trump forgetting Jesus and God on that day. Anyways, so then, just a quick overview of Esther 1. Like I mentioned, there was a 180-day banquet in Esther 1. That's the time of 666, which we've already seen with Trump. See my previous videos if you don't know what I'm talking about. And then what I'm wondering is, then it goes on that they had a 7-day banquet. And so I'm wondering if that's the Jewish people in week 1 feasting on the deal of the century, like I said, this last week in January. And then it talks about Vashti holding a banquet for the women. And so then I think that's a picture of the American people feasting on the State of the Union. So we see this picture being repeated throughout Scripture. Okay, so then to Bei Shavat, I already talked about this in one of my previous videos, but I wanted to talk about how, so last year in 2019, there was a supermoon on Tu Bei Shavat, and so what I saw was that we could be seeing a possible fulfillment where God was making a promise to Abraham that a year from then that Sarah will have a son. Now, so that's why we're looking at the Tu Bei Shavat, to see if there's a fulfillment. But one of the things I wanted to mention is that this is kind of depressing and sad, but one of the things is that the fulfillment of this could be, because what we see in this story is that Sarah goes and she makes 3 bread cakes. Okay, 3 measures. She takes 3 measures of fine flour and kneads it and makes bread cakes. Okay, so we're seeing like a picture of Trump 666. And so then it says, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Okay, so what we see is like Sarah, who made 3 bread cakes, is giving birth. Okay, Okay, so we could see a fulfillment of this with Trump, where we had Trump do 666 and then he gave birth to this deal of the century, out of the 666. And so then, um, you know, so that's a possible fulfillment. But then, let's read on in the story, because then it says, then the men rose up from there and looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. So it still goes on to talk about resurrection, and Sodom being judged. So it's still coming. So don't give up. But just wanted to talk about the possible fulfillment. Anyways, but let's look at the shadows of Tu B'Shavat, because I do still think it's a very significant date. What was kind of interesting to me is that we had, in January 21st was kind of like the 1 year anniversary of last year's super blood moon, on Tu B'Shavat. And so it was interesting that actually happened, and so it was actually the wolf moon. And so it was interesting that was exactly 1 week before. So it was like 1 year and 1 week that, like Trump birthed the deal of the century. But then we have on February 10th, we have the Hebrew date. I mean, we have Tu B'Shavat actually happening again. And so it's called the New Year for Trees. So I mentioned this before. There's 6 seasons in Israel. And Shavat 15 to Nisan 15 is the season of cold, which comes after the season of Koref, winter, and before the season of Katsir, reaping and harvesting. So what happens with Tu B'Shavat is it's the end of the rains, okay? And what happens is then new rain is provided for the trees in Israel, in this new season. So there's definitely prophetic shadows with that, because if you recognize that the lies of Trump and the lies of Obama create a sea, like the rain, the 40 days and the 40 nights of the rain that we see in the story of Noah are like the 40 days of rain of Obama's lies and the 40 days of rain of Trump's lies, okay, to create these two seas of lies, and so then people are either following Obama or they're following Trump, okay? And so we like the fact that in Tu B'Shavat, it's the end of rains, so, are we going to be entering into a season where it's the end of the rains of the end of the lies of Obama and the end of the lies of Trump, okay? And then they on Tu B'Shavat they eat 7 fruits from Israel, so definitely a messianic picture there. They read the 15 Psalms of Ascent, so definitely a messianic picture there. They have a Seder, so it's interesting that there's kind of a repeat of the Passover picture, with the Seder. And then once again, let's read this. Earliest blooming trees in Israel emerge from their winter sleep and begin a new fruit-bearing cycle. So, similar to the Groundhog story. And so like I said, God's people, we're going to be entering a season where God's people are going to emerge from their winter sleep and, actually start bearing fruit. That God is going to take us out of our bondage and, we're going to start bearing fruit. And two, like emerging from our winter sleep would be like a picture of we are no longer under judgment. The judgment switches, like the cup of Pharaoh going from one person's hand to another is this picture of like God's judgment. He's going to take it off of his people and then put it on his enemies. Put the cup of judgment into their hand. And then Deuteronomy 20:19. So the Jewish people translate this part of the verse where it says man is a tree of the field. And the Christian translations, they don't know what to do with that. That just sounds weird to them. And so they try to make it say trees are belong to men, or something like that in their translation. But I think a more literal translation is man is a tree of the field. And so I thought that was interesting because um, you know I'm wondering how much of a messianic connection is in Tu Bei Shabbat. And so New Year for trees is definitely a good time to be looking for the Messiah to show up. And then that would connect to like the Christmas tree being a picture of Jesus, the Hanukkah, seven branched candlestick is a picture of a tree, would connect to the Messiah. Okay, and then I mentioned too about Hanukkah was a picture of either increasing light or decreasing light. So we definitely see Trump decreasing light with his actions during this Hanukkah season. Are we going to see increasing light? I like that we were blessing candles on Candlemas because, that could be a connection to the Messiah. And it also the whole connection of him being presented in the temple. Okay, so let's see, in Revelation 11, okay, so I talk about these verses a lot, but we're definitely seeing their fulfillment. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. Okay, I won't read all those verses, but you can read them. And so, so I talked about like the deal of the century is being released by the two witnesses, Trump and Netanyahu. So we're seeing that. Okay, they finished their testimony. Okay, so then according to these verses, the next step is war, the beast coming up out of the abyss and making war with them. And then I thought it was interesting too that, we had, Trump, first did his deal of the century on the 28th, and then it was interesting that, on the 29th, we had Netanyahu said what he said about the deal of the century and Trump, so definitely seeing both of them having testimonies on that day, on that in that week, so definitely very interesting.